My name is Robert Pickethley, and I'm a tutor in management and fellow of St Peter's College in Oxford University. I'm also a committee member of the Oxford Intellectual Property Research Centre. My interest in IP management resulted from having qualified and worked as a UK and European patent attorney, both in private practice and in industry. What I'd like to talk to you about today, though, is the links between strategic management, intellectual property management, and the concept of patent density. The focus of international competition is always changing. Following the 1950s, mere availability of goods, then productivity, cost reduction, and by the 1980s, quality have all been in the spotlight. However, in the past 2 decades, innovation, and thus intellectual property, have held a key position. It's always been important, but there is something special about innovation and intellectual property as an enduring focus of competition. To begin with, though, let's look at some of the basic ideas in strategic management. Michael Porter identified cost, differentiation, and focus as generic strategies. However, strategies based on cost are susceptible to erosion by competitors. Niches may be also susceptible to entry by competitors. But differentiation is, I might say, different, but certainly more interesting. Competition based on cost involves a race downwards to achieve the lowest possible cost. There are almost always limits, both technical and commercial, to the lowest cost levels competitors can achieve. The result is that those competing on cost eventually end up in the same place with similar low-cost positions and little competitive advantage. Competition based on quality might for a while provide a means of differentiation. However, quality too is usually defined in terms of minimising something. Quality too is a race downwards, in this case towards a zero level of defects. The result is that those competing on quality may also eventually end up with similar levels of high quality, or rather low defects, and again, little competitive advantage. In contrast, innovation, and in particular technical innovation, is a means of differentiation which is upwards and without limits. An innovative firm that bases its strategy around technological innovation will encounter competition. It may choose to use technology in a number of different ways. However, technological innovation is something to which there is no limit. There's always the possibility of something newer and more innovative. Only the intellectual resources of the firm are going to limit what it might be capable of. Of course, innovation can take many forms. There are technical innovations with new products, new processes, and improvements in both. There are non-technical innovations, such as in marketing and business models. Costs of implementation for any innovation are going to be substantial, but the costs of developing technical innovations are likely to be far higher than for developing non-technical innovations. The latter may just require thought. The former may require both thought, practical work, and substantial financial investment. Any firm considering investment in technical innovation is going to want to be sure the investment can be recovered and not lost to free-riding competitors. And even with non-technical initiatives, there can be concern about competitors free-riding on the better reputation of their more innovative competitors. It is here that we find another link to general strategic management thinking. There are 2 main schools of strategic management thinking developed in the late 70s and 1980s. The first is the outward-looking industry structure analysis, which Michael Porter's 5 forces model describes. The second is the inward-looking, resource-based view, highlighted by Birger Bernefeld, but developed by several other authors as well. These two schools of thought are usually seen as opposites. Each looks in a different direction for sources of competitive advantage. One looks outside the firm at the characteristics of the surrounding industry, and the other within the firm itself. However, a key feature of both is that of the need for barriers to competition. Michael Hotter's industry structure analysis focuses in part on the barriers to entry. These were originally highlighted by writers on industrial organisation economics. Such barriers can make industries attractive places to compete and do business. However, the inward-looking resource-based view also highlights the need for barriers to competitors. Barriers around valuable resources, or as one writer, Richard Rummel, put it, isolating mechanisms. In both of these cases, these barriers to competition help give firms a competitive advantage. Edith Penrose was an earlier writer on the role of resources in firms in the 1950s, but Penrose also wrote about the role of the international patent system. This, of course, reminds us of the link that exists between technical innovation as a resource, which can give competitive advantage, and the need for barriers to competitors, which will help protect that investment in developing the technology. Of course, firms have a number of different ways of creating barriers to competitors. A number of surveys, both for research based in the US, from the UK innovation surveys, and more recently from the UK patent awareness surveys, which I carried out for the UK Intellectual Property Office. All of these have shown that firms value a number of different means of appropriating the returns from their inventions. Some, which might be called strategic means of appropriation, for example, secrecy, speed to market and the like, are popular because they don't require much in the way of costs. However, they also have disadvantages. They may be inapplicable to many inventions, or they may be short-term, or as with secrecy, they may rarely involve legal sanctions which can fully compensate for their breach. The message for IP managers, though, is to recognise that intellectual property rights are one means amongst a range of means that managers may use. Strategic means of appropriation may be popular, but the fact remains that intellectual property rights are perhaps the best means of providing the legal barriers that firms need. They're thus essential in helping society ensure that investment in innovation is rewarded sufficiently to justify that investment. Good intellectual property protecting a firm's innovation does not, as the writer David Tees points out, automatically guarantee success. That depends in part on the balance between the strength of the appropriability regime, effectively the strength of the firm's intellectual property rights, and the firm's access to, or possession of, what are called complementary assets needed to make a success of the business. And there's finally the role that dominant designs or standards might play in an industry and the success of a firm's products. The greater the strength of a firm's intellectual property rights, the easier it will find being able to gain access to crucial complementary assets that it may need but doesn't have. Conversely, the weaker the strength of a firm's intellectual property rights, the more likely it is to be defeated by those who do control those key complementary assets. And in such cases, it's obviously even more important that the firm itself has good access to or ownership of those crucial complementary assets, wherever possible. A crucial point here is that the complementary assets that TISA describes may just as easily depend not only on other complementary assets, but complementary intellectual property rights held or controlled by other firms. It's important to recognise that both intellectual property rights and complementary assets are both firm resources, and ones which are central to strategic management. In his classic definition of strategy, the writer Alfred Chandler said that strategy is the determination of the basic long-term goals of an enterprise and the adoption of courses of action and the allocation of resources necessary for carrying out those goals. Penrose, who I mentioned earlier, also highlighted how firms are made up of those resources. However, the idea that intellectual property itself is a business resource is not something that is new. When conducting research in the early 1990s, where I was comparing Japanese and UK management of intellectual property, I came across one company's IP department which had the following slogan: let's use intellectual property rights as the fourth business resource, along with people, things and money. So, something that one can also find in earlier Japanese publications of the Hatsume Kyokai on the topic of IP management. Now, whilst IP managers need to keep the role of patents and intellectual property in perspective as one very important resource amongst many, one might say, in the firm, it's also critical for senior management to remember that IPRs need just as much management as any other business resource. Innovation is thus arguably the one perpetual focus of business competition. Firms should therefore, wherever possible, acquire strong intellectual property rights to help protect the competitive advantage provided by their investment in innovation. Intellectual property in general, and patents in particular, are thus critical to the role that technology plays in business. But of course, industries differ. Some intellectual property rights, such as copyright, designs and trade secrets, are obviously more applicable in some industries than others. However, if we focus on patents, what is critical to the way in which patents operate in different industries? The size of firms will obviously be one factor. The products that the industry produces will be another. But there's another characteristic that I think we can look at, which might best be described as IPR density or patent density, that of the products that the industry manufactures. This idea first occurred to me in the early 1990s when looking at the very different ways in which some Japanese and UK firms dealt with intellectual property. Essentially, there were, in many cases, differences. This idea first occurred to me in the early 1990s when looking at the very different ways in which some Japanese and UK firms dealt with intellectual property management, especially when there were differences in the products they produced. Put simply, the average number of patents per end product in an industry will have a very significant effect on the way firms in the industry manage the patents involved. Of course, the total number and quality of patents in the industry and that individual firms possess may alter their individual competitive position. But looking at an industry as a whole, the nature of IPR management is going to depend very strongly, simply, on the amount of IPR involved in each main product. Does this patent density really differ much between industries. Even a moment's thought shows that it clearly does. Sometimes the fact is even made the subject of advertising campaigns. Quite separate from my earlier thoughts about Japanese and UK IP management, in 2006, Audi, the German car company, ran a TV advertisement in the UK which simply highlighted the number of patents involved in developing the Audi A6. It used the slogan, "To date, NASA has filed 6,509 patents. In developing the Audi A6, Audi filed 9,621. Of course, two immediate points to make are that a national space agency and a car company operate in very different industries. Secondly, quantity of patents is very often not as critical as quality. Of course, two immediate points to make are that a national space agency and a car company operate in very different industries. And secondly, that quantity of patents is very often not as critical as their quality. Nonetheless, it is true for any car manufacturer that each car will involve a lot of patented technology, some of it perhaps patented by other firms who may be suppliers and even competitors. It is, of course, important to emphasise that it is easy to file lots of patent applications. It's worth remembering that in the late 1980s, when there was lots of emphasis on patent application numbers in Japan, I noticed that the ratio of Japanese patent applications filed in Japan by Japanese nationals to the number of Japanese researchers in Japan, according to STA figures, that ratio temporarily almost doubled. The aim, of course, is not quantity, but quality. Of course, one might easily contrast the car industry with the pharmaceutical industry. There's an obvious contrast. Pharmaceuticals typically have one or two key primary patents on the basic compound, and then possibly some secondary patents aimed at how they are to be delivered to patients. And then, depending on the jurisdiction, perhaps even patents on some secondary uses discovered later in their life. The number of patents per product is clearly going to be considerably less than for a car. Of course, it's not just the pharmaceutical industry which has perhaps lower patent density, as I've just defined it. Let's take Dyson, the UK vacuum cleaner manufacturer. While some of its earliest patents have expired, it has a very active IP and patenting policy. Nonetheless, compared to a car, a handheld vacuum cleaner, even a technically advanced one, has a lot fewer parts. The DC-30 handbook, for example, lists 37 patents or patent applications. Now, some are European patent applications and some are PCT applications, which are going to result in more national patents. Nonetheless, whilst there's a lot of patents for a vacuum cleaner, the number of patents per product is around 100 times smaller than the case of Audi's car. What then are the consequences of this high or low patent density that a given product might involve? It's been suggested to me in the past that the initial surge in interest in patent applications in the late 1950s and 1960s in Japan was due in part to a boom in the white goods industry, which was then going through a boom. The historian Mark Fruin also mentions the industry's aim of supplying everyone possible with the three household treasures, that being a cooker, a refrigerator and a television. Such products use a wide range of technology, and essentially those are moderately high patent density products, and it would have been difficult for any one manufacturer to own all the technology essential for a successful product. The result was an incentive for these manufacturers to acquire large numbers of patents and patent applications so that they could be used in cross-licensing with the other manufacturers. And what all this illustrates, perhaps, is that high patent density fields and social and technical incentives for cooperation promote a patent culture where numbers are important. In the chemical and pharmaceutical fields, patents may be even more important for their quality though, since patent densities are low, with only a few patents per product being relevant in the pharmaceutical field. It's worth mentioning that the use of the word density in association with patents can be used in a number of different ways, in particular depending on what the denominator is. I've used the product as the denominator, but others have been used. For example, look in the WIPO statistical reports. There you can see patents per unit of GDP, patents or applications per million of population. And these measures can be used to assess countries' level of innovation, perhaps. More recently, Carl Shapiro has drawn attention to what he called a dense web of overlapping intellectual property rights that a company must hack its way through in order to actually commercialise new technology. Or in other words, what have come to be known as patent thickets. This line of thought, however, attempts to focus on not on the patent density as I've defined it, but on the density of patent claims, or perhaps a number of other definitions which are related to that. The general idea being that if there are sufficient claims, especially of ones of doubtful validity, crowding a given technical space, that may hinder entrance to the industry and restrict innovation. Now, it might be said that while some research shows that this may be the case, for example by Hall and Helmers and others, at least part of the real problem with so-called patent thickets is not the numbers of patents involved, perhaps, but the number of invalid patents involved. Not the numbers of patents involved, but the cost of expert advice and litigation. If all patents were valid, and all legal and litigation costs relatively cheap, there arguably wouldn't be so much of a problem. Indeed, Sir Robin Jacob, a UK judge, has been quoted as saying of patent thickets, "It is in the nature of the patent system itself that this should happen, and it has always happened." Nonetheless, there is a correlation between large numbers of patents deployed by firms in an industry and both patent density, as I've defined it, and separately the possibility of what we've just been talking about, these so-called patent thickets. What all of these various definitions of patent density involve, though, is the same numerator, the number of patents involved. It's worth noting which sectors the world's greatest filers of patent applications around the world are in. Look at the list from WIPO's statistical report, which summarises the top applications filed between 2003 and 2012. And this shows that virtually all the top 30 firms are in the electronics, telecoms, or car industries. Essentially, all industries with what I would term as high patent density. The top 4 firms sum this up quite well: Panasonic, Samsung, Canon, Toyota, and Toshiba. Of course, we need to note that one can have high patent numbers simply by having a large firm and a lot of innovation, or even, as has been pointed out earlier, a decision to file more patent applications. Moreover, not all patents in a given product need to be owned or filed by the same applicant. Indeed, if one looks at the automobile industry, one might well find that the firms most interested in carefully defending their patent rights are not so much the large car manufacturers themselves, but their network of suppliers. Patent disputes between major car manufacturers, which come to public notice, are relatively rare. Those between suppliers are much more likely to occur and to be noticed. Indeed, no one might label it as a special case for reasons I'll come to in a moment. One manufacturer, the US-based Tesla, recently made a great play of making its patent portfolio freely available to all other car manufacturers. This, of course, brings us to considering what difference patent density, as I've defined it, makes, especially to IP and especially patent management. There are many topics that one can focus on, but I'd like to highlight just 5. IP departments, licensing, litigation, learning and startups, and finally industry structure. Probably the greatest influence on a patent department is the volume of work it has to deal with. Multiply the caseload, and the patent department somehow has to cope with the increase in work. Indeed, it may be exactly the increase in work that justifies the creation of an in-house patent department in the first place, rather than the exclusive use of patent attorneys and offices in private practice. One can therefore presume that one is more likely to find in-house patent departments in firms in industries which have high patent density, simply because the products are going to involve a much greater number of patents. Even if an individual is not a major patent filer itself, of course, the need to interact with firms who are is going to mean that firms in such industries will encounter more IP cases to deal with than firms in low patent density industries, perhaps. That said, low patent density industries may be subject to other factors which affect the nature of the work that their departments have to deal with. Whilst the volume of first filings may be lower, there may be more extensive foreign filing programs, for example, and that to some extent may compensate for the lower patent density. The firms with the largest IP departments, though, are, I think, always going to be those with the largest patent portfolios, and all other things being equal, those are going to be the firms in the areas with the highest patent density. Now, the more patents are involved in a product, the more those patents are going to be dispersed across a range of different players in the industry, the more there's going to be a need for greater licensing activity. And with this comes a whole raft of other considerations: the formation of patent pools, issues of antitrust law and competition law. Now, if, despite high patent density, there tended to be a separation of complete patent portfolios, each of which enabled production of competitive products, then perhaps this cross-licensing would be unnecessary. However, even in such a situation, the moment one has 2 competitors who might beat a third competitor by mutually cooperating and cross-licensing their technology, there is going to be an incentive to get involved in that cross-licensing. This is unstoppable. And I think the greater the patent density in any field, the greater the incentives are going to be to enter licensing deals amongst the various players in the industry. And that would be not just for those reasons, but also, as we've seen earlier, where there is the risk of patent thickets, licensing deals cross-licensing and patent pools are one way of solving such problems. Of course, the higher the absolute number of patents a firm might be trying to license, the more important the question of transaction costs becomes. So where you have bulk cross-licensing of technology and where that becomes commonplace, as is the case in many areas such as the electronics industry, of course, the higher the absolute number of patents a firm might be trying to license in or out, the more important the question of transaction costs becomes. Consequently, bulk cross-licensing of technology may become commonplace, as is the case in many areas of the electronics industry. The moment that happens, of course, the role of patents will begin to shift into a new game, one where taking part in the game in the first place necessitates having something to trade. In that case, high patent density, whilst increasing cross-licensing propensity, may then also in itself lead to even higher patent density as new competitors struggle to build their own licensing portfolios in order to deal with their competitors. Now, licensing occurs where firms reach an agreement not to litigate. The flip side of that, of course, is litigation, and one might expect to see a decrease in litigation amongst competitors in high patent density fields where neither side has much to gain from litigation and much to lose, if both sides are likely to find areas where the other party is arguably infringing their intellectual property rights. And of course, there are two key exceptions to this. The first is that the incentive to cross-license depends on the lack of balancing payments being mutually beneficial. Where one of the parties is not a manufacturer, that all changes. Non-manufacturing entities with relevant and infringed patents may comprise, for example, old competitors exiting the market, or non-practicing entities which have acquired their patent portfolios. Such firms want money, not a cross-license. And of course, that reduces the possibility for negotiation. The other main exception is where dramatically new technology is drawing in new, not just technology, but also competitors. Such new developments risk destabilising industries that might have comprised a number of peacefully coexisting firms, coexisting large firms, and ones with a range of suppliers. The other main exception is where dramatically new technology is drawing in new competing technology and competitors. Such new developments risk destabilising industries that might have comprised a number of peacefully coexisting large firms with a range of suppliers who might be litigious as between competing suppliers, but perhaps not with those supplied. Whilst the car industry has been relatively stable for some time, the arrival of, for example, new technology, and especially electric cars, could destabilise the industry with sort of consequent potential for increased litigation over potential key technology. This, in a way, is reminiscent of the early patent wars, one might say, faced by, for example, the aeroplane industry, or even the nascent internal combustion engine powered car industry in the very early 20th century. Of course, the recent case of Tesla, which I mentioned earlier, where it offered to license its patent portfolio to others, is perhaps another symptom of this. But I think it's one where a firm's effort to license its technology may perhaps be driven more by concerns about swaying this battle for what David Teese, who I referred to earlier, would have referred to as the dominant design in the newly emerging market for alternative power sources. If one can sort of free up access to one's technology, that may make it more likely to be adopted as the dominant design in this new era. Of course, in May 2015, Ford, of course, similarly offered a portfolio of electric vehicle patents for licensing. So Tesla is not the only firm involved in these sorts of games. Whilst most commentators, I think particularly in the field of management and economics, seem to think that licensing in or out of technology is perhaps a new phenomenon, it's worth pointing out, I think, that this idea is very far from new. If you look at GE, even in the middle of the 1920s, they clearly realised the implications of high patent density for their licensing strategy, as you can see on this slide here. Of course, large firms may be involved in high or low patent density industries, but for small firms, existing in such, or rather existing in each of these, is a very different proposition. In a low patent density industry, such as pharmaceuticals, it may be possible for a small startup firm to establish a vital position in an industry by inventing and patenting a key compound or a method, which is then able to begin to exploit itself or sell or license to others. At the beginning of the 1980s, the genetic engineering firms Biogen and Genentech were such examples. More recently, any number of pharmaceutical-based startups have been able to monetize their inventions or innovations by selling their firm and or its IP or negotiating so-called early-day licenses to fund their continued research. It's therefore quite possible that given a good intellectual property position, even a small firm might reap substantial rewards. However, in a high patent density industry, the chances of a small firm succeeding so easily are much reduced. As mentioned, some recent patent thicket research funded by the UK Intellectual Property Office, by Hall and Helmers and others, suggested that large numbers of existing patents in a field may discourage new entrants. In such situations, it's quite clear that a new entrant simply does not have the intellectual property or other resources to compete directly with large incumbent firms. Any one invention, which is a component part of products as a whole, is unlikely to be absolutely essential or an absolutely essential element of the product, as may have been the case in a low patent density field. Consequently, the power of the small firm in such a situation is considerably reduced. It's not entirely removed though, and perhaps the greater the revolution promised by the new feature that's been invented, the greater the bargaining power the inventor might hold, if there are realistic alternative customers to deal with. Finally, as has perhaps been deduced from all the above, the competitive nature of an industry will to some extent depend on not just the distribution of resources, but the distribution of patents related to the particular products involved. And also, as a result, the patent density for those products. One result of this is that more developed industries, where perhaps the rate of innovation may have slowed and the patent density in force has fallen as a result, may become susceptible to domination by any remaining firms that continue to invest in innovation in the field. There may not be much that is new, but those who control it may dominate their few remaining competitors. This may seem obvious, but the reason I'm making the point here is that patent density is something which is dynamic. It's something that is continuously evolving. So assuming that a steady state is going to persist may not always be justified. Well, to conclude, intellectual property management is something that firms ignore at their peril. However, the task firms face, both in terms of the administration and in terms of how they interact with other players, is inevitably going to be linked to the patent density of the products the industry produces. If one's just going to be considering a single product, patent density obviously puts the emphasis on quantity of patents. But I think my final point should be that whether one is operating in a high patent density field or in a low patent density field, the key to good intellectual property management is having good quality intellectual property rights.